Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff that went wrong, and why it's kind of difficult to deliver 1,500 years of one of the world's most intellectually complicated religions into 10-minute YouTube videos. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and we're talking about the Buddhist Expansion. And I thank you every time, patrons, but I really need to thank you this time. This series specifically would not exist without you. A History of Buddhism was never going to do the numbers of like a Crimean War or Henry Ford, which is our next series. But because we have support on Patreon, we can look at topics that might not be as grabby for the algorithm, but are still really important and are good resources to have out there. Let me get going real fast because I went 45 minutes. I had way too much fun in the first take. So we're gonna snap, snap, snap. If you want to see our Henry Ford series, first episode is already on Nebula First. I am really looking forward to this one. Recommended reading for this series is Great World Religions Buddhism from the Great Courses, Foundations of Eastern Civilization on the Great Courses. I had a lot of fun listening to my research, pretending I was back doing my religion degree in college. There's a great BBC series called In Our Time, which has an episode called The Buddha, which has a wonderful little short thing to listen to. A Concise History of Buddhism, 500 BCE to 1900 CE by Andrew Skilton, and Buddhism's An Introduction by John S. Strong. This is a very good book, and the reason it's called Buddhism's plural is it kind of talks about how Japanese Buddhism is so different to Indian Buddhism that it's almost like they're different religions, and how that progression happened, which is the thing that we charted in this series. So highly recommend that one. That was also very much how I was taught the history of Buddhism. Just a quick background of my own history with Buddhism. As I mentioned in the series, I majored in religion kind of accidentally. I just took so many religion courses because they were interesting that I ended up with a second major. My main major was history. But Buddhism had kind of always been there in my orbit. I grew up in Hawaii. I had friends who were Buddhist. My church that I went to was across the street from a Buddhist temple. We used to go to Buddhist festivals, you know, Obon and things like that. So it was always kind of present in my life, but I didn't necessarily understand a lot about it until I got to college and started kind of investigating through academia what it was all about, the history of it, how it influenced East Asia in particular. I did a lot of Chinese and Japanese religion courses. And of course, now I've lived in Asia for 10 years. I've been 10 years in Hong Kong. I've traveled around a lot. This is some of the stuff I've collected. Well, not this. This was my grandmother's. But yeah, I've talked to a lot of Buddhists in a lot of different countries at this point, and been very interested in both the folklore and the belief systems and how they differ. So it's a long-term interest of mine, and I'm glad that we finally got to feature it on the show. My dad was actually briefly a Theravada Buddhist because he served as a radio advisor to the Royal Thai Army during Vietnam. So actually that was the unit. It's a t-shirt that he wore during the Tet Offensive. I do want to mention the difficulty of this series. We were heavily generalizing a very complicated and nuanced topic. There's no Buddhist canon in the same way as there is one for Christianity. It's a lot of different sources for it that don't always agree and have often been adapted to specific areas or specific traditions. So, because people will sometimes adapt a text retroactively, right? They'll put in reasons of like, this is why we do this thing in the current day. Here is the evidence for it being done like this at an earlier time period. So things can differ a lot from one tradition to another. But, you know, even accounts of the Buddha's birth, as we'll talk about in a second, can vary a lot. We had some comments that were not incorrect that suggested we oversimplified things, like that we overemphasized the split between Theravada and Mahayana, that you do have Theravada groups that will, like in Sri Lanka, who accept the Lotus Sutra as part of their canon, but you know that's normally a Mahayana thing. So these lines can get a little more blurry. Absolutely true. We were just really trying to give people who are not familiar with it at all more of a one-on-one version of it. Really hard to boil this down into a 10-minute video, especially because Buddhism is very heavy on terms, and sometimes those terms don't have perfect equivalents in English, and trying to get that across without using an English term, which is like 3 or 5 words long, because we have 1,500 word scripts, very, very difficult. Didn't always do it perfectly. 100% agree. If this interests you, I highly recommend you read the comments on some of our episodes, because they're always really intelligent and enjoyable to read. And there are people who are pointing out differences in the traditions that they practice, or different stories that they learned, or people who took exception about how we term something. And, it's important. You should look at that. Also, often I will use kind of religious studies terminology, which is not necessarily the same way you'd talk about a religious group if you were inside it. Or I'll use terms that are kind of trying to meet people where they're at if they're not familiar. So it's absolutely true that, for example, there are more Vajrayana Buddhists as a whole than there are people in Tibet. So to call it Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit wonky, but it is very commonly referred to, especially in the West, as Tibetan Buddhism. And I just wanted to use a term that people associate with, like, oh, okay, I got it. Dalai Lama mandalas, that kind of thing. Because if you don't know, then it's very important to have a term that is a little more familiar. In the same vein, in trying to put Vajrayana in there as kind of a B-plot in episode 5, I stated some things in a way that created errors. I didn't mean to say that both Zen and Shingon were Vajrayana traditions. Shingon is, but Zen is influenced at one point by Vajrayana, and that's partially because Chan Buddhism became Zen Buddhism, Chinese Chan Buddhism, and there was a period in the 8th century where a lot of Chan Buddhists were going up to the Himalayas, and there was kind of a cultural exchange going on between Chan Buddhist practitioners and Vajrayana Buddhists in Tibet. So again, there's lots of mixing, there's lots of influence from one to the other. It's not necessarily clear-cut. All of this is very, very complicated. But we're doing YouTube videos where we're trying to simplify it to the point where someone who has no background can understand it. Patron question from Douglas McLean. I noticed that you divided up the Eightfold Path by wisdom, conduct, and meditation, but the third one should probably be cultivation, or bhavana in Sanskrit. Cultivation includes meditation, but also includes chanting, visualization, mantras, etc. Yeah, this is from a visual we took from a Buddhist website that I put on our platform for collecting images for artists to pull from. Is a bit too general, and yes, that's absolutely correct. Thank you for using the Buddha, not Buddha as in a name. The Buddha is a title in both Theravada and Mahayana traditions. Shakyamuni Buddha, Shakyamuni means sage of the Shakyas, is seen as one of a very long line of Buddhas who appear in the world, rediscover the Dharma, like Newton discovering the laws of physics, and preaches to others. This is especially prominent in Mahayana Buddhism, of which I am a follower. Yes, we talked about that in episode 5. Patron question from Hercules. I was wondering if the ascetics that Siddhartha practiced with were Jain monks. The extreme asceticism and starvation makes me think of Jainism. So I was wondering if you could shed any more info on that. If we take this as strictly a historical story, which I'm a little more iffy on, probably no. And you can't say definitively. The story is largely legendary. We don't have really great sources on this, but there is an ascetic tradition in Hinduism, and my guess is they would more likely be from that tradition. Jainism, if you're not aware, it's an Indian religion that practices fairly extreme ascetic ways of living among their monks to ensure nonviolence. And this includes wearing veils so that they don't inhale insects, sweeping the path in front of them with soft brooms so they don't tread on insects, sometimes restrictive use of water, not to waste resources, including things like not using flush toilets sometimes. Very, very extreme Jain monks will not brush their teeth because they don't want to harm the microorganisms in their mouth. It's a really, really fascinating bit of world religion. the connection it has to Buddhism is it comes from kind of that same period where everyone is going through a religious anxiety, where the current religious systems are not really working. And this is the same stuff that births what eventually becomes Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism. YouTube question: I wish you covered the full battle scene between Mara and Buddha, because it isn't just him repelling an army. In the standard mythology, it actually ends when Mara bellows that it is he who really provides meaning in existence, and all his demons scream in agreement. Mara then taunts Siddhartha as to who will vouch for his so-called enlightenment, and that's when he touches the ground, and there's the earthquake. Yeah, it's a really neat scene. Already excited for lies on this. I'd love to know which tradition you're pulling the mythical details from, because I've been a Buddhist for a decade now, and this varies a lot from the version I was taught. Never heard of the birth from mother's side or the white elephant. Love to know which early texts or later texts you checked for hearing about this version. Variance doesn't bother me personally, and I enjoy learning other versions. His teachings are ultimately what's important. Yeah, this is a very standard Buddhist belief that necessarily like the truth or veracity of specific stories about the Buddha's life are not as important as the message. So again, this makes it a very malleable tradition, which can change from place to place. But where I specifically got these is they were in the lectures I listened to. I heard them in college. But where it really stuck in my head is when I went to Borobudur in Java. This is the version of the birth that is, carved on the temple walls there. And I just thought it was very cool. And it's also very common in Thailand. I've seen it in mural paintings in Thailand. And even here in Hong Kong, not too long ago, we had the Buddha's birthday, which is a public holiday. And I took my kids to a temple because they're obsessed with Buddha. They really like Buddhist temples, and also Chinese folk religion and Taoist temples. They don't really know the difference. They think everything is Buddha. But they had a place where you could wash a statue of infant Buddha, who was standing on a lotus, raising his arm, saying, "This is my last rebirth." And it was really neat. It was in this kind of bowl, and there was water all around it, and he was kind of standing on a lotus podium, and you would scoop in. And what's interesting is, that's really similar to how you would wash a linga stone, right, a Shiva stone in Hinduism. So there's clearly been some overlap there, right? Episode 2, patron question, Brian Rose. On the subject of early Buddhism's offer of redemption to all, an egalitarian message, would you agree with some historians that early Christianity offered a similarly revolutionary appeal to Greco-Roman society? How would you compare these conceptions of moral equality? Both had a pretty revolutionary message. What I find really interesting about the story of Angulimala, which I don't think is that, to me it didn't appear that common, is this idea that, okay, you're spiritually reborn, yeah, and it's wonderful that that's happened, but you still have to suffer karmic consequences from this period in your life. And this doesn't save you from the judgment of the people around you, who may still be angry about the fact that you killed their relatives. It just feels like a very modern conception of forgiveness and redemption. By the way, the Buddhist prison chaplaincy in the UK is called Angulimala. So it's an interesting way of how it's still, the story is still functioning in the modern day. Patron question from Bright Ops. What were the legal consequences that came with someone seeking to convert to make up for past crimes? Depends on where and when you're talking about. In general, if you were a monk, you were safe, and if you stayed in the monastery. Specifically in the story of Angulimala, the king pardons him, believing that he's been reborn and is not even really the same kind of person who carried out these murders. The Angulimala story is a huge story. There's all sorts of background of how he became this killer. That was kind of added later. Like many early stories, it's just like Angulimala is a killer because he's a killer so that he can be redeemed. There's not really an interest in like why Angulimala became a killer. He's just sort of a vicious guy. But then there's these later editions about him being tricked essentially into becoming a wild serial killer who can't control his violence and becomes animalistic. But before, he's like a brilliant student, and his master, for various reasons, gets upset with him and says that the thing that he must do to thank him for his education is to go out and kill 1,000 people and cut off a finger from each one of them. So this is a little bit taking the burden off of Angulimala. But yeah, there are places, there are very heavily Buddhist countries that sometimes you can have debts forgiven if you go into a monastery. I don't know so much about like crime and criminal records, but I know that in Thailand, sometimes when people are running from like the Thai mafia, they'll go into a monastery because there's still that idea that if you're a monk, you're sacrosanct, like no one can touch you. YouTube question. He says, correction, the first Buddhist monks and nuns were allowed to eat meat. They were just not allowed to slaughter animals for food or grow their own crops for food. In fact, Devadatta, the cousin of Buddha, who was famous for attempting to kill Buddha and split the Sangha, the Buddhist community, actually instituted vegetarianism as a mandatory rule for monks who joined his breakaway group. The reason why monks and nuns in East Asia do not eat meat is largely because of negative cultural attitudes toward begging and living off alms. As a result, monks and nuns in East Asia had to be as self-sufficient as possible, while at the same time committing as little violence against sentient beings as possible, which is why monks and nuns in East Asia are vegan, while those in Southeast Asia, Tibet, Bhutan, and Mongolia still eat meat and beg for alms. Yeah, I think there can be some variation in this, but wonderful comment. Good background. I feel like I've certainly met monks in Thailand who were vegetarians, but this is something I'll defer to the commenter on. Buddhists don't believe everyone goes to hell between rebirths. It's a full destination, only one of 6 possible realms, not an in-between destination required to burn karma. I have read the opposite. This is something that may vary. Certainly I've read that one of the reasons that kind of Buddhist hell is considered more forgiving is that you're not there permanently. But maybe you're transitioning to another realm after that. Maybe it was a misunderstanding on my part. But I'm fairly sure that I've read that you can be reborn after being in one of the realms of hell, which are amazing. It was not during the first Buddhist council that Buddhism was written on paper. It was during the fourth Buddhist council. This is something that's debated a lot among historians. It generally depends on if you believe certain legendary accounts versus what historians think happened. Historians will often say like the fourth Buddhist council. But we were in the print the legend part of this series, so I said the first Buddhist council. Episode 3. YouTube question, what a legendary opening scene with Ashoka and the robots. EH animation has really come a long way. Nick really knocked it out of the park. I do want to point out that some people get upset if you call these robots. They are automatons that have had a spirit possess them. And one thing that's really cool about that is there's this whole backstory. In Buddhism, almost everything has some crazy backstory that is not just, you don't necessarily hear, but these automatons were supposed to have been made by a Greek man who came from ancient Greece to ancient India and built them. And what's interesting about that is that we do know that there were automatons in Greece, so maybe one of Ashoka's ambassadors had seen one of those, or maybe someone did come from India with an automaton, and this story came from the memory of that. When we talk about Ashoka being forgotten, I want to point out he was never forgotten by Buddhism. There was always stories of this righteous king, but it was only when the rock edicts were translated that it was kind of rediscovered that this was a historical figure, not a legendary one. And there's still a little bit of wrangling about the rock edicts because they don't all refer to a king with the same name. And the belief is that these are several different reign names of the same person, though there are opinions that are not necessarily majority that one or two of these rock edicts actually come from a different ruler. But in general, we consider Ashoka a historical figure now. Someone said, when I was in Lumbini, I saw one of the pillars of Ashoka there. It marked the place where the Buddha was born. Quite impressive to witness. In general, it's an amazing place to visit. I can recommend it. Also, on the pillar is written that because Lumbini is such a special place, Ashoka gives all inhabitants there a tax cut. Yeah, this is another way of spreading Buddhism and promoting Buddhism, right? Like, if you live in an area that's a major Buddhist pilgrimage site, not only do you get the economic benefit of being a pilgrimage site, you pay lower taxes. not only does that attract people to the area, but it ensures that place is going to grow in economic strength, which if you are trying to boost the level of acceptance and conversion to Buddhism, it's a good way to do it. I love comments like this. To put this timeline in perspective, this episode is discussing a religious leader, Ashoka, who was born over 300 years before Jesus was and 900 years before the Prophet Muhammad was, and he wasn't even the founder of Buddhism. It's very important to remember this with early Buddhism, that the sources we have are scant, and they are frequently from later than the period being talked about. And in the case of the Ashoka Rock Edicts, you also have to take them with a grain of salt, because there is some propagandizing going on in these. But, for example, in the areas he conquered, there's a lot less about him being a wonderful conqueror who conquered all these areas. He's clearly being a little bit careful how he spoke to those people. Episode 4, if anyone is wondering where the Emerald Buddha is now, the statue is located in Wat Phra Kaew in Bangkok. Fun tidbit, the Thai general mentioned in this video who stole the statue eventually became the first king of the current Chakri dynasty. Yes, I've seen it. Very much recommend visiting that. Also, the reclining Buddha in Bangkok is astounding. It's the largest in the world. It has scenes from the Buddha's life on its feet, inlaid in mother of pearl. And I believe it also has is it both scenes from the Buddha's life and also the things that presaged his birth? I think it might be both. It's one or the other. It might have been the signs of his birth, actually. I might be wrong about that. Sorry if I'm wrong about that. Also, we talk about it being kept in a certain Wat in Chiang Mai and it partially collapsing in an earthquake. This is Wat Chetty Loang. I've talked about it before. I taped the beginning of our Building Angkor series in front of it. It's probably my favorite temple in Chiang Mai. I really like it. They have a really neat program called Monk Chat where you can just go and talk to monks and they kind of learn your language better and you learn about Buddhism. And you can ask them basically anything about Buddhism or their lives or Thailand. Really, really wonderful program. Definitely go. If you go to Chiang Mai, go do that. It will be a highlight. It's very interesting how Buddhism shaped from place to place. In Laos, for example, where I used to live for 8 years, they took on many animist traditions that were already common, which allowed for pretty quick adoption. Heck, they even made their own tales of past lives of the Buddha, which are riddled with local religious beliefs. This is really, really common. There was a huge, I think I read at one point, there are 500 volumes of stories of past rebirths of the Buddha. I thought about including some in our series. There are things where he's an animal, like a bird, even. And basically they're parables. They're ways of showing demonstrating some aspect of Buddhist thought, worldview, or principle. And what's kind of neat about them is because he's not yet the Buddha, right? He can be a little imperfect. He can get things wrong. We talked about this in our One Off the Buddha's Wife, which I hope you all enjoyed, where, there's that previous rebirth where he's not the Buddha yet, and he kind of becomes a little bit rude to this older sage. And there's also, interestingly, same thing with that episode, there is a strain of thought that has come in kind of the modern era where people are kind of will wrestle with Siddhartha abandoning his wife and son, and that this is kind of against modern day moral values, particularly in the West. A lot of Western Buddhists will struggle with this story. And one of the things people will say is he's not the Buddha yet. He's not enlightened yet. He's still a fallible human being who is maybe not doing things perfectly. Might have been better if he told, everyone that he was leaving. I wanted to do that story, one, because we didn't really talk a lot about women in Buddhism during the main series, and this was a great way to sort of bring that in. But I also just thought it was a really neat example of how a story can change and shift based on the tastes of later times and places. Someone asked, I'm curious if the tour guide in Cambodia actually believed the stuff about the king, or he was just trying to impress Rob as a tourist. Yeah, it was a guy. He was yes, he was incredibly intense. He very much believed it. I don't think that's necessarily normal. Also, I do want to mention I was there in January of 2014, and there was some pretty serious political instability going on. Like a couple of days later when we were in Phnom Penh, there were armored personnel carriers on the street and barbed wire roadblocks and guys with AKs standing outside them and things like that. So people were very tense when we were there in a way that I didn't really, because I'd never been before, I didn't realize that was not normal. So that may have affected some of my interactions with people. I found people to be quite standoffish and anxious. But, when I got back and I talked to a lot of people who, would do social work missions in Cambodia and had been there like 3 times a year for the past 10 years, they'd be like, oh no, Cambodia is incredibly open and welcoming and warm. And I just was there at a time when everyone was very, very tense. It would be kind of like if you've never been to the United States, but you just happened to visit like the week of January 6th. That would change things a lot, right? So please mention the Indo-Greek kingdom of Menander I Soter, one of the first Greek converts to Buddhism. The Greco-Indians there too were some of the first to make physical representations of the Buddha. Yeah, this is an Indo-Greek ruler who ruled a large kingdom in what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan from about 160 to 130 BCE. That whole Greco-Buddhism thing is really interesting. I'm really sad we skipped over it. It's not in the long term super influential, which is why. But it might be a good topic for like a short or a one-off. So I'm not going to go too much into it, but that's a good idea. Thank you for reminding me. Patron question from John Smith. It was my understanding that Tibet actively resisted Buddhism for many centuries. Is this incorrect? It didn't officially arrive till the 7th century and really more through the 7th through 9th. And then in about the 12th century, there's kind of like a dip in a religious fragmentation as well. So it does come a bit later. It's not a straight trend line. Again, when we do this whistle-stop tour, sometimes we don't spend as much time making each specific area as textured. Patron question from John Cox. You showed a modern Chinese flag. Yeah, again, it's just we were moving really fast in this episode, and I wanted to keep things visually comprehensible. So that's just the symbol we used. YouTube question. Someone wanted to know more about Japanese Buddhist clergy in World War II. Yeah. So over the last few decades, there's been a lot more work on Japanese Buddhism and World War II massacres, the kind of things that Buddhist clergy were saying to the army, involving whether massacres in China or Korea would reflect negative, bring karmic punishment on them, and kind of creating reasons why that was not true. You might have seen a little bit of this in our Japanese militarism series, right? We talk about a lay Buddhist preacher who was in charge of an assassination movement, right? The League of Blood. So there's been a lot of that. A lot of work on that that's been very interesting. I also wanted to say, I don't want to make it seem like Mahayana Buddhism is obsessed with money or anything like that. It's not. It just is. It's different, is what I mean. That filter of the merchants definitely has some effect, and you do have in Taoism and Chinese folk religion, you have a god of wealth, and that certain aspects of it do get subsumed into Mahayana Buddhism. But it's not overly obsessed with money than any other religion. I mean, you go to Theravada Buddhist temples in Thailand, and there are going to be shops around them all over the place. And sometimes people, in one particular temple where you kind of release animals to build merit, you're buying this turtle and you're releasing it into a pond, and some guy's at the other end of the pond fishing it back out with the net to go and sell it again. So basically, we're all humans, and humans are imperfect. We're humans living in a society where money is a factor. Yeah, every religion is going to have some kind of commercialization to it. pretty much. Yeah, so no knock on Mahayana Buddhism. Again, like it's the one I'm most familiar with, and I have the most contact with. We wanted to go into Shaolin monks more. We didn't really get the time. Happy to do it at some other time. If you were wondering, where is Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own right and a major champion of Buddhism? Well, I have great news for you, because coming up on Extra History, we have Henry Ford. That is going to be such a great series. I don't want to jump the gun too much and tell you too much about it, but it's going to start out really bright and optimistic and gradually just get darker and darker and darker. I often, when I finish a series, I'm like, great, don't need to read about that again. I'm pretty much good on Little Ice Age. I'm pretty much good on, whatever. But Henry Ford is something I will absolutely be reading about him more in the future. He is a really fascinating character. Not a very nice one, but very fascinating. After that, we have the Little Ice Age, which is going to be a great climate history and environmental history series. It's also the thing that is probably the most commonly requested item on Patreon. Almost every vote, someone will say the Little Ice Age, so we're finally doing it. And after that, Empress Wu Zetian, hated by gods and men. Oh man, I am 3 scripts into this, and I love this series. It's going to be one of my favorites, I think, we've ever done. It's a lot of court intrigue and murder, and she is such an interesting, ambiguous, powerful personality. There's witchcraft, there's false accusations, there's lots of kind of concubine harem drama. There's a Chinese drama series, TV drama series called Empress of China, where she's played by Fan Bingbing, and it's 82 episodes long. That's how crazy this gets. It gets 82 episodes of a soap opera crazy. We're going to really enjoy it. The next series after that, now up for voting, is Revolutionaries. We're doing stuff like Marx, Sitting Bull, Lenin, Emiliano Zapata. Maybe finally the Mexican Revolution. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys vote for. If you want to vote, you can join our Patreon. Quick Ibn Battuta side trip. I want to talk about a festival that is being celebrated currently in Hong Kong right now as I'm taping this episode, the Hungry Ghost Festival. This is my favorite Chinese festival. It's sort of like the Chinese Halloween. There's a belief that around this time, the gates of hell open, and the hungry ghosts in particular come out into the land of the living. Hungry ghosts, depending on who you're asking, whether they're Buddhist or Taoist, they either are spirits that their descendants no longer sacrifice to them, they've been forgotten, so they are emaciated and kind of zombie looking, or they have had some kind of awful karmic crime. Frequently, they try to eat any food they find, but like their necks are as thin as needles, so they can't swallow, or they have fire in their mouths, so the food gets burned up to ash before they can swallow it. They're really grisly, gnarly creatures. And so there is a holiday specifically to keep these ghosts away from your house and to give them some relief. People put out food for them. They will stage Chinese opera performances with the front rows empty for the spirits. And they'll have Buddhist and Taoist rituals to ease their suffering. And sometimes there'll be like separate pavilions for like the Buddhist area and the Taoist area, but sometimes the rituals will kind of be side by side or even a little bit together. And again, this is just a great example of how Buddhism will find space and find commonalities, because hungry ghosts were present in Buddhism and they were present in Chinese beliefs. So I think this is just a really amazing example of how Buddhism will find its little niche, and it will find commonalities with the people that it is come among, rather than finding differences. And actually, I have the King of Ghosts here on my table today. When you go to Hungry Ghost Festival, they will have a big effigy of the King of Ghosts, and he's burned at the end of the festival. I'm taking my kids. It's going to be fun. See you next time with Henry Ford. Beep, beep.
What if I told you that Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Casey Mustra, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kuya Koi, and Skylar Holmes were all legendary patrons? I'm not kidding.